'Tis the season for hanging out by the fireplace and not going out and flying. It's the season for scud running and inadvertent VFR flight into IMC conditions. Today we're going to discuss an accident that happened in October of 2 years ago. William Bushling and his Cessna 150 that went missing near Dunsmuir, California. I had a lot of questions about that crash when it happened, but I had no data. There was no NTSB data. With no data, there's no story. But now the NTSB final report is out, and it explains exactly what happened in this crash, and it also gives a good background as to what was happening in William's life at the time of the accident that creates some of the human factors in the chain of this accident. Let's check it out. This accident happened 2 miles northwest of Dunsmuir, California, here on the I-5 corridor, where I-5 snakes up from the northern end of the San Joaquin Sacramento Valley past Lake Shasta and on up through the mountains into Oregon. And this pass is notorious for scud running in an effort to get through this pass between Oregon and California. Once you get down here in the Sacramento Valley, the weather's generally pretty clear. Mr. Bushling stacked a lot of odds against himself on the day of this accident, but he started out with, first off, never getting a pilot's license. He's what I call a rogue pilot or a professional student pilot, somebody who never bothers to get his pilot's license. The non-certified pilot departed on a cross-country flight that required multiple fuel stops. The weather forecast called for clouds near the accident site. During the fuel stops, the pilot recharged the battery and at one instance refused assistance from a witness to find and replace his alternator. His alternator had gone out and he was flying with a dead alternator, basically a dead battery. He would charge his battery enough to start the aircraft and then would shut the master off. And you can do that with these Cessna 150s or these simple Cessna aircraft. You don't need the battery to run the aircraft, and you don't need the battery to run the flight instruments. They are driven off of a vacuum pump, which is driven off of the engine. Witnesses stated that he sparingly used the battery power for takeoff and landing and continued his cross-country flight with a known inoperable alternator. Post-accident examination of the cockpit revealed that the master switch was in the off position. With the master switch in the off position, the electrical system was not powered and the airplane is not able to transmit its aircraft's position over the ADS-B system. So that's why we had no ADS-B data on this accident. His alternator was broken and he had turned his master switch off. The field examination of the airplane wreckage did not reveal any mechanical malfunctions or failures that would have precluded otherwise normal operation. A witness near the top of the mountain reported that the clouds and fog were present and provided a visibility of about 200 feet. He added that about the time of the accident, he heard a low-flying airplane and was able to distinguish noise consistent with a running engine, but did not hear the impact on the terrain. He further reported that the fog was present for most of the morning, lasting throughout the early afternoon. Very common up there in the mountains in the North State. The pilot was likely flying the airplane low over the interstate to stay out of the clouds. He then likely entered IMC conditions, entered into the clouds, so you're hemmed in down there in a relatively steep but fairly wide canyon, and then poof, you're in the weather. And you're not only not instrument rating, he doesn't even have a pilot's license. As the airplane approached the mountain valley and turned back towards the departure airport. Okay, this explains why the crash scene is to the north, before impacting trees in a wings level attitude. No record was found indicating that the pilot received a pre-flight weather briefing. However, it could not be determined if the pilot obtained weather information using other sources. There was some toxicology reports that indicated he had some antihistamine in his system and some antacid. Probable cause and findings: the non-certified pilot's improper decision to continue flight under VFR flight rules, visual flight rules, into instrument meteorological conditions, into the clouds, which resulted in controlled flight into terrain. So they figure, looking at the wreckage, that he didn't lose control of the aircraft and spiral out of the clouds. Rather, he tried to turn back to the right and impacted the terrain in the weather. And here's all the different odds that he stacked himself against himself. He never got his pilot's license. He was operating with the alternator broken and the master switch off. And then he's flying in mountainous terrain, in the weather, low visibility. And if we look at some of these personal, very sad personal reports, we can get an idea of what exactly was going on in his life that was pushing him to continue to get there with the get-there-itis. So once you get to the final report with the NTSB that took 2 years, you get this thing called the docket. And this is all the information that they created, all the files they created on this accident, and from this is where they draw their probable cause and conclusions. Here's a couple photos from the investigation. The Cessna 150 was a very well-known, noticeable Cessna 150. It had this amazing flame job on the side of the aircraft, and it had a couple of other odd modifications to the aircraft. There's a look at the tree, and so we're looking back to the north. So he turned around to the right into rising terrain instead of being offset far enough from the terrain in the canyon. That's why you always want to leave yourself a way out. I've done some Scud running in the past, but I've always left a way out, or so I thought, and you've got to stay to one side of the canyon or the other and give yourself plenty of room to turn around, and you need to turn around early and divert early, and don't push it into the fog or the clouds. I don't do that anymore. Here's some of the highlights from the on-scene field notes where they figured that the aircraft had turned to the right to the north to try to get out of the weather. Here in paragraph 2.4 about the cockpit, the master switch was in the off position, so the pilot had put the master in the off position to save the battery. All other instrument switches were also in the off position. That would mean things like lights or pitot heat and that sort of thing. It doesn't mean the vacuum instruments, the artificial horizon, assuming that he had still a vacuum-driven artificial horizon, or did he have any electronic flight instruments that were in op as a result of this broken alternator. The ignition was in the both position, the fuel selector was in the on position, and the aircraft was modified by removing the pilot and co-pilot seats by a bench installation. He was a big guy, but he had changed these seats somehow, and the control yokes were also modified by a dragster type steering wheel. Odd. Here's a picture of the mags on both, master switch off, and here's the rocker switches for the other electrical systems, but it doesn't show a picture of the panel. Was he running off of a vacuum system or a EFIS style system? With the exception of the alternator, the engine was found to be in good condition. Pilot information. According to FAA Airman records, the pilot had an expired student pilot certificate and reported civil flight experience that included 200 hours in the last 6 months on his aviation medical examination dated March 16th, 1999. So no license and no medical. A witness added that the pilot had been flying as long as he has owned the airplane, which covered 20 years. That's what I call a rogue pilot. The day before the accident, Williams stopped at Independence, Oregon, where the NTSB later got this witness report. On or about the 19th of October, he stopped at EAA 292 Clubhouse in Independence, Oregon. That's a great place to go for help. Those are a great bunch of guys up there, and they will take care of you if you let them. On his way south in his spectacular Cessna 150, referring to the paint job, the flame paint job, because his alternator had died. Homer helped him charge his battery, and we both repeatedly offered to find him an alternator, figuring someone on the air park at Independence would have one that would work in the 150. He refused all help. When we showed concern for him flying over the mountains on battery alone with his EFIS off to save power, he blew us off. So that's the first time I hear in any of this report that possibly this 150 was modified with an electronic flight instrument system rather than the stock vacuum-driven instrument system. That would be significantly different if he's flying around without any alternator or any battery power. because if his EFIS was off and he had no vacuum backup, he would have no source of artificial horizon or reference to which way is up. Another witness reported the pilot refused the help offered to replace the alternator and was told by the pilot that it would take too much time to replace the alternator. The witness added that it seemed to him that the pilot had a get-home-itis demeanor. Now the NTSB gets a hold of the girlfriend of William Bushling, the pilot, and this is the sad story that explains what was driving William to run so hard, to stack all these odds up against him. What was the distraction? The accident flight was the return flight home after the pilot was visiting his friend Richard, who was his best friend, who was diagnosed with cancer. The pilot was at Richard's place in Washington to help evaluate his properties, complete any other projects, and to help get his last days going. Richard decided not to finish cancer treatment and wanted to spend quality time with his best friend. Bill decided to stay a week since he only had a week's worth of medicine. He was to fly on Saturday, October 16th, but the weather forecast was not ideal, so he departed on October 19th. He wanted to get home to get his medicine. She added that the accident pilot was anxious to get home. The witness added that the pilot usually stops near Cottage Grove, Oregon, that would be close Independence, basically, for aviation gas and usually visits the witness's kids. In Salem, the pilot checked the oil, refueled, and departed for his next leg of the trip. She added that the pilot seemed frustrated with the airplane, that he might be having some trouble with his gas gauge. Once the pilot landed at Ashland, a mechanic stored the airplane and the pilot stayed the night. In the morning, she stated that the pilot fueled the plane and departed about 0940 for his final leg to Orland, California. She added that the pilot did ask about the weather, and she stated that the airport in Orland had blue skies with puffy clouds to include blowing winds. The witness stated that an hour after their conversation, about 11, the clouds turned gray and the winds increased in the valley. Shortly after, she called the pilot's cell phone, but he did not answer or return her call. She was worried and remembered that he told her years ago that he had flown in bad weather to just learn how to fly in bad weather. Thank you so much for your support of this channel, especially the folks over on Patreon that make this content possible. See you here.